Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is David Hoffman. I am a member of the faculty of the Bioethics Master's and Certificate Program at Columbia University, and I am very pleased to welcome you to tonight's continuing education program, which we provocatively entitled, Should You Pay the Ransom? Navigating the Law and Ethics of a Ransomware Attack, the Special Case of Healthcare Institutions. So what we're going to do tonight is walk through some of the background that everyone should be aware of, and then move into a discussion of how healthcare organizations in New York, but really globally, should be reassessing the way that they approach the issues of ransomware and the larger issue of how do we deal with cybersecurity in the context of a healthcare delivery system that has been forced by the market and by regulators and by accreditation organizations to become increasingly dependent upon and tied to electronic commerce with all of the risk that that presents. And that will be the discussion for tonight. We are offering continuing legal education credit for this program for New York State lawyers. So obviously, some of us are lawyers, so here's all of the technical details. We can also offer a certificate of participation for lawyers from other states and for people in other professions, and you can use that certificate to seek continuing education credit from your respective disciplines. Here's the cast of characters for tonight. I've introduced myself. Let me next introduce Tom Halsey, the Director of Health Information Technology for Haney's, the Healthcare Association of New York State, who's going to be talking about cybersecurity and ransomware risk from both the technical and public policy perspective. We have Sue Regan, who is a healthcare lawyer who I've known for many, many years. She has spent an entire career in private practice and then became in-house counsel for the Visiting Nurse Service of New York, now known as VNS Health. She stays on with that organization in a volunteer capacity as the co-chair of the VNS Hospice Ethics Committee. And you will hear from, albeit in a pre-recorded fashion due to an unavoidable scheduling conflict, Cordell Schachter. Cordell has been in a variety of chief information officer roles in his career in and out of government, most recently as the chief information officer for the New York City Department of Transportation, and now as the chief information officer of the U.S. Department of Transportation, reporting to that fellow named Buttigieg. The presenters have disclosed no financial conflict of interest, but of course, we should remind everyone that the opinions we are expressing today are our own opinions and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of our organizations. So here's the agenda. We're going to look at the background, and I'm going to describe as context the experience of a group of hospitals and other healthcare facilities that I have been advising for years that were the victim of a ransomware attack. We're then going to move into a discussion of how advocacy is working to make the survivability of a ransomware attack a little more manageable, and look at some of the legislative initiatives that the state government and other organizations have offered to level the playing field. So we're going to talk about both the legal and ethical obligation to report the fact that you've been a victim of a ransomware attack and what the advantages and disadvantages are of that process. Then we're going to turn to what you should do before, during, and after a ransomware attack, and talk about what role a lawyer should have in raising this issue in the awareness of senior management of healthcare organizations before an attack, and what kinds of questions pop into a lawyer's mind when you find yourself literally with one phone call or one email, worried about nothing else that's going on in your organization other than surviving the ransomware attack. And then we'll move into a discussion more broadly, and we'll do a little role play where Sue Regan will be the surrogate for all of you in the audience who maybe have never been the victim of a ransomware attack and therefore haven't thought about it quite in the detailed way that I have, just since my hospitals were attacked just a little over 6 months ago. And we will have plenty of time for questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. We will answer them as we go along if that's appropriate, but any questions we don't get to, we will have time for that at the end. For those of you seeking New York State CLE credit, I should remind you, I know you all know this, that there will be participation codes that you need to scribble down or send yourself a text message. Two of them, one midway and one toward the end, which is your way of proving to the Office of Court Administration that you actually stayed for the entire program and you were paying attention. Oops. Let's first think about and remind ourselves why we're here. Why is this important for lawyers, administrators, ethicists, everyone involved in the provision of healthcare? Why is it important for us to be taking a moment out of our otherwise very busy lives to think about the before, during, and after of a ransomware attack? And I will tell you the reason is it is all-consuming. When you get the call or the email, and I'll describe my experience of those phenomena in a few minutes, everything else that's going on in the hospital kind of falls by the wayside, other than the immediate need for direct provision of healthcare to patients in the emergency department and inpatients whose care needs to be maintained. And of course, we're going to talk some about what we euphemistically refer to as downtime procedures. So my hospitals had the unfortunate privilege of being picked up by the entire healthcare and IT trade press almost immediately, because we did the right thing and reported what happened immediately to the health department and to the FBI. And so this was September 15th in Becker's Health IT. I'm guessing many of the people joining our program tonight read this fairly religiously. And this is how it started. New York hospitals still reeling from ransomware attack. That was a little hyperbolic. We were only reeling for the first 24 to 48 hours before we sort of assessed what was going on and got our feet back underneath us. But that's a point worth observing, is that the press loves a sensational story. And so they are more interested in the story of who paid the ransom and who didn't, and who was able to continue to provide patient care and who wasn't. And all of that turns on the central question: whose backup was restorable and whose wasn't? As we begin, I want to observe, as we all did at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, I frankly cannot imagine how my hospitals would have gotten through both the pandemic and the ransomware attack without the availability of Zoom and cell phones. So we should not take those blessings for granted. It is very much the case that central to our response plan and our ability to get back on our feet quickly was our ability to communicate with our administrative and clinical staff by cell phone in real time when our VoIP, voice over internet protocol phone system, was as affected by the ransomware attack, at least initially, as everything else. and having Zoom available as a way of communicating and coordinating. Obviously, incident command becomes the central feature of your life during one of these attacks. So thank you to Zoom and thank you to cell phones. So here's the question I want to start with. How did we get here? And what we need to think about in terms of how we got here is the ethical and technological context of ransomware and data privacy obligations that are incumbent upon healthcare organizations in a way that is unique to healthcare, right? I'd like to describe the difference between healthcare and everything else that goes on in society as being analogous to changing a flat tire on a bus while it's moving, right? There is no downtime. There are no weekends. There's no summer break. There's no shutting down the assembly line for retooling. So we have to know going in that we are doing all of this work on the fly in real time. Oops, wrong way. I can't start any conversation about the relationship between law and bioethics without reflecting on the pronouncement of Benjamin Cardozo in 1914 in the case of Schlöendorff versus the Society of New York Hospital. Cardozo articulated this legal and ethical norm. He said, every human being of adult years and sound mind has a right to determine what shall be done with his own body. Interesting gender choice, since Schlöendorff was Mary Schlöendorff, and the condition for which she was being treated was uterine fibroids. But I ground our conversation today in this observation, which is literally the start of the notion of consent, not informed consent, but what we call simple consent, just the notion that people ought to be informed of and give permission for things to be done to their body. And my suggestion for tonight is that the same ethical principle needs to apply to one's body of information, one's medical and other financial information that is stored on our numerous IT platforms, and that we have to remember that that right of notification and consent ought to be central to the way organizations respond to the compromise of patient data in a ransomware attack, which is something we'll get into in much more detail when we get to our panel discussion. Let's go back in time just for a moment so that I can share with you what it was like for me for the first time in my 38-year legal career, being the victim of a ransomware attack. So we knew something was going on and that there had been a movement of data that just didn't make sense to anyone on August 30th and 31st this past summer. But it was on September 1st at 7:19 a.m., an email I will never forget, that we learned that, in fact, we had been attacked. We learned who we were attacked by, and we were told by I've been told the technical term, one of the many things I've learned that I wish I never had to. We're told that we're supposed to refer to them as threat actors. I often slip into referring to them as the bad guys because it has more emotional resonance. But we got an email and they told us what they wanted us to know about the nature of their attack, that they had encrypted all of our data and that they had exfiltrated it, meaning moved it out of our IT system to an unknown, or what initially was an unknown location. And this was the first lesson I learned about how an institutional lawyer ought to respond to a ransomware attack. These people, the threat actors, the bad guys, they're criminals. They will make stuff up if they think that's going to get them a bigger ransom faster. And it is no kind of a secret, because it was reported throughout the trade press, that the ransom demand that they made was $4.5 million, which is a ridiculous sum of money to ask of two small safety net and critical access hospitals in a very, very remote part of New York State. But so be it. And they wanted us to believe that if we didn't pay the ransom immediately, and if we didn't forestall notifying law enforcement, that they would sell all of that information on the dark web. So I learned that there actually is a dark web. It's not just a euphemism. It's an actual place. I'll show you a picture of it in just a moment. But we shouldn't get too deep into this conversation without acknowledging that ransomware would not be a feasible crime. That is one that you have a reasonable expectation as a bad guy of getting away with, if it weren't for Bitcoin. The notion that ransom can be paid in a manner that is entirely anonymous, and that therefore it can be very hard, if not impossible, to actually track down who attacked you. We'll talk about how that might happen in some cases, but so often doesn't happen. But that needs to be part of the context within which we examine how organizations, as a matter of organizational ethics, ought to respond to a cyber attack. We're now going to move on to some details of the nature of a cyber attack with the help of Tom. Tom, who brings his expertise as a hospital chief information officer for decades to his current role as the head of IT, both technical advice and strategy, to his role at the State Hospital Association. So Tom, talk us through the role of advocacy and the need for preparedness in preventing, if you can, or responding to a ransomware attack.
Okay, thank you, David, and thanks for setting that up for me. The slides here are really just about the new state proposed regulations. You can go to the next one. But as I go through them, what we'll discuss really is these concepts in a little more detail that are in the regulations, how they apply to mitigating, I can't say avoiding, but mitigating the attacks, lessening, hopefully, how easy it is to get to you, and then mitigating the attacks themselves. So before I jump into them, I think we have to go back one more. Yes. I just want to mention that there are rules that already apply. The HIPAA rules that were expanded with the HITECH Act did require certain cybersecurity regulations or a baseline to be met. That's fairly basic, but it does include, as is listed here, an annual risk assessment, and then a list of items to be addressed and reviewed each year within that risk assessment. Now, certainly at the federal and state level, in reaction to the events like David just discussed and so many other hospital events, as I've learned more so at Haney's than anywhere, governments are pretty reactionary. They have reacted certainly to those events and have at both the state and federal level promised at the federal level, actually proposed at the state level, some regulations that apply specifically to hospitals. And it's interesting as well that the federal rules were promised with a statement that was put out the very day the state rules were proposed. So I'm sure that's not a coincidence. As an IT person and math major, I don't believe in coincidences. So we realize regulations are coming. And I'll add to that with a little more commentary that I don't see on both the state and federal level, we thought by now we'd hear more. And I suspect one of the reasons we haven't is because of the Change Healthcare attack, which, by the way, did not directly attack any hospital. And therefore, any regulation a hospital had would not have aided with the overall disruption. We might theoretically have some better mitigation strategies in place, but really those weren't in the rules. So I'm going to go through these, and I'm going to note the federal aspect as well as we go. So really, it's a lot about expanded policies and procedures that very specifically get into certain aspects. I'm not going to go into the detail of the procedures to secure your environment, such as training your users. Probably the most key aspect right now, because almost all of these incidents that breach a hospital are from one of two means, and that is a third party, which there isn't too much you can do about, but we'll get into that, or social engineering and phishing and attacking one of your employees. And we were just discussing before this, as we talked about sending around a DocuSign document, that right now there's a bunch of fake DocuSign emails going around. And it's a pretty good case, particularly to use. It's a great tool because if someone even has access to some of your email, then they know that you use this and that it's going around, and they know how to phish, as you will, social engineer exactly what to send you. So some of these policies in general are a pretty good idea. The annual risk assessment, as I said, has a little more detail than the federal, but it's something we should already be doing, which points to one of the issues with the new regulations, which is that we don't audit the old ones. So we're jumping on, boy, we need some rules. Well, nobody was looking at whether we were following the old ones. Not that I'm saying that's what we need or that would solve the problem. And I'll get into that in a moment.
And can I just say something about the annual risk assessment? Having spent my entire career at safety net hospitals that are always squirreling away every resource for patient care, and having been in a lot of discussions about, do we really need an outside vendor to do this? Because the vendors we know make a fortune at this. Having been through my experience, any of my reluctance about recommending spending the money for an outside risk assessment have dissipated, because you just can't get institutional buy-in if you don't have a risk assessment that has been benchmarked by typically a national vendor, so that you know what your efforts look like in relation to what is the accepted standard of practice. So
completely agree. That. And I would preach at least a decade or more ago that it at least be every other year. But things have gotten considerably worse, and you need to have a plan. You can't, no matter how many resources you have, you can't be completely secure. But nonetheless, you have to have a plan for where is our greatest risk and how are we moving forward. And that's part of, and I'll get into our advocacy on this in a moment. So a few other items, the incident response plan, I bring that up, of course, because that's one of the most important aspects. I think we'll talk about it a little later when we all discuss. But if you haven't, if you're the chief counselor at a hospital, and you haven't been a part of some kind of tabletop testing the scenarios David just spoke about, then you probably should soon, because you need to know these things in advance. You should already, someone at your organization should already have a relationship with the FBI, for instance, and know what to do and how to do that. And they'd be happy to take part or even run a tabletop for you. They do a lot of great work with that. Nationally, CISA would do that as well. So if you haven't seen that happen, ask about it. It should. And then you have to have it. Oh, go ahead.
CISA, just for everyone who's not aware, that's a long, complicated acronym.
Like all of them, yes, Chief Information Security Officer. So that will be required. However, that could be contracted out for, again, it could work somewhat like an additional outside audit. So you could have a third-party company be your Chief Information Security Officer that would then sign off on all your policies and rules, be a part of all your reporting every month to month, rather than just annually. So if you don't have the finances for a full-time CISO, which if you are a small community hospital, I assure you, you don't, assuming you could even find one. So that's at least a part of this. Again, it's still proposed. You can go to the next slide, David.
Oops, sorry. There we go.
So a couple others that we're going to talk about with the advocacy end is the third-party risk review. We've all been hearing a lot about Change Healthcare, obviously a third party that was attacked. Oh, can we go back one?
Oops, sorry.
Wonder if they're on a timer. That might have been my
No,
doing.
that's my fault.
Okay.
I brushed the key.
So I'm going to dig a little further into that. I think when we have our discussion later, the third party is extremely important. It's also something that's in the proposed, well, it's not proposed, it's the promised is the term they use, federal regulations, and their goals that they set for hospitals, cybersecurity, the third party risk review. Now, it's one thing to review the third-party risk. That should be part, of course, of a security risk assessment. But additionally, the state and the feds as well are talking about the appropriate contract terms to aid in your safety. And this something we're really pushing back strongly on as well with the AHA as well, because in our marketplace, anyone who works with IT in particular, but probably a lot of other services in a hospital, there isn't exactly a wide open marketplace. We know we're using Microsoft. We're probably using Epic, Meditech, or Cerner, Amazon, Google. We don't have any leverage for contract terms with these companies. So it's completely ridiculous to put the onus on a hospital to have contract terms that are beneficial to them when there is a breach. The same could be said for United, Optum/Change. We certainly don't have leverage. There's near monopoly there, as the disruption is showing us, and they affect all the different pieces. And then the state rules say that you have to report a breach to the Department of Health actually within 2 hours. And so I'm going to get into that in just a moment, because exactly what that means and when you would do that is a bit much. And then they want us to meet all of this within a year. So this is pretty difficult. Let's go on to the next one. So just a quick look at the policies and procedures. This is pretty straightforward. Most of this, we should be doing this now. The difference here would be that it's signed off by a CISO. It's reported to and approved by the board, your plan every year. I think it specifically requires monthly updates to the board, but I can't, it might actually, was only proposed and we're pushing back on it. It might actually have only been quarterly, but I would suggest it.
Yeah, I think it is quarterly.
Yeah. And I think you should be doing that now.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not, as David could tell you after those events, the board should be aware, and they're really trying to put more of the burden onto the board as the leaders of this organization, that they should understand what this means and its importance. And I think that's great, because as you mentioned earlier, we need from the very top to understand how severe this can be before we get hit. Because everyone has said what you said, David, that I've ever spoken to, that, boy, after we went through this, we put a lot more money into this. Well, maybe we can get to where that happens a little sooner, but it's difficult. There are organizations, as you know, that just don't have the finances for that. And I'm going to touch on that in a moment. Next slide.
Let me say really quickly about the whole Change Healthcare situation. It has brought to a head a great many issues, too big to fail being one of them. So I think these are on a timer. That just happened automatically.
Yeah, I think I apologize for that. So
That's
that's
okay. I'll keep
I
an eye out.
probably cut and pasted them into a PowerPoint that was set on some timer.
So what I
Uh,
wanted to point out though about
yes,
the Change Healthcare situation, and this may be the topic of our next program, this really calls into question in a big way the clauses that we're seeing more and more from vendors, which is the limitation of damages provisions that say if we do anything wrong, no matter what, the amount you can recover from us is limited to the amount you paid for the service. And I consider that outrageous at minimum, and potentially, and Sue will talk about this later, potentially unconscionable. So,
yeah, and that those kinds of contracts exist now, as we're using an EMR that operates every aspect of the organization, and on top of that, we're beginning to add in the cloud vendors of Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, who are running everything. But yeah, the Change Healthcare also points out the near monopoly of some services and the extreme outreach, if you will, the extreme access of some huge companies in healthcare like United. And there are others like Epic that are at least oligopolies, if not monopolies, and the effect that has. So I won't get too much into this. The requirements for auditing, incident response planning, recovery, pretty straightforward, pretty reasonable. These aren't a big deal. But if you go to the next slide, oh, I just want to. Oh, that's terrible. This didn't come out too well on the screen. But the definition here, and this is at the state level, that they want a 2-hour turnaround to notify them of a cybersecurity incident, which is an incident that has a material adverse impact on the normal operations of the hospital. Did you know that in 2 hours, David?
well, that's the interesting question is where does the knowing come into this? Because on Wednesday, we knew something weird was going on. On Thursday, we knew that someone outside of our organization had moved some data, but that happens with IT vendors. And it was Friday morning at 7:19 a.m. that we knew, no, it was Lockbit.
Right. And even then, I have seen cases where, as you said, you're dealing with thieves, if you will, threat actors, but bad guys, as you said, and bad guys can't be trusted. That's the whole point. So I have seen cases where they said, we've encrypted all your data, and they hadn't.
Right. In fact, that's what happened to us. They said that they encrypted and exfiltrated everything. And in fact, they had encrypted and exfiltrated a very, very limited amount of data. The hard part was figuring out what was what.
Right.
And that's a job that is ongoing now, all these months later.
Right. So it's difficult. You may have known then because of what they had gained access to, that this had a material impact on your operations. But even exactly when that is decided isn't necessarily when you've gotten a message. And so we are certainly advocating, and I've met with the Department of Health a bunch of times, that this should be 2 hours after your emergency management committee, after David and others have been notified, mapped out their plan. Now you know, okay, this is going to affect operations. And I also know how it will. So I have something to report to the DOH. So it's not finalized yet, and that is a bit extreme. Everything else is 72 hours. Next
Although
slide.
I would suggest that as an ethical norm for us as organizations, notifying the health department and or the FBI sooner
Oh,
is not a bad idea to at least consider, because it gives you a chance to say, hey, we don't quite know what's going on. We don't know if it's material, but we wanted to know if you've heard anything about similar experiences by other hospitals at this moment. So,
and that's a great point, actually, because certainly with the FBI, you want to notify them and see what they can do for you. In some of these cases, they have the decryption tools. They just don't announce that so that the bad guys don't know they have.
right.
Because obviously, if they publish that, then they'll change it. So absolutely. The issue is that we've discussed with the Department of Health is what kind of questions will they be asking? So you're right. They are talking about holding back with digging in with too many questions. This is just a notification, more to come. Then absolutely, completely reasonable. But we've also pushed, and they've said they will do this as part of the regulations, that there should be some kind of statewide, so we can make it more regional, sharing of this information.
Mhm.
So if the state's going to learn it, how are they going to tell your neighbor
Mhm.
so that we're all aware of what's happening there? And some system that would allow us to do that. And they've agreed to create, in order to build that, some kind of statewide healthcare cybersecurity. I think they called it roundtable, not the term I used, but we did ask for that, and they did put that in. So, and I think that will be helpful as well, because down the road, I've been trying to create that under Cuomo. We had started that type of group to really help the smaller organizations, like up in the Adirondacks, who have so little funding, because there's the ability to share information, but it's not particularly useful if you don't have people dedicated on site to ingest that and act on it. So we're looking at how the bigger can help the smaller. And all of the academic medical centers I've spoken to are happy to do so. So
That will
next
help.
slide. I might be going beyond my time, so I don't
That's
want.
fine. We're good.
Okay. So what we're pushing back on the most is we need to align federal policy and standards with the state. And I think that's pretty well understood. However, there are still some differences, so we're hashing those out because it's clearly we can't have two different responsibilities. The third-party responsibilities, I noted, I'll say that at the federal level, we're completely in agreement with the AHA, where they've stated bluntly to HHS with their proposed or promised regulations that anything that A, blames the hospitals, and B, applies only to the hospitals is unacceptable.
Right.
And that's pretty reasonable. And only the hospitals, again, the change hack shows us that that's not useful. Third parties, hacking is a business now. You know, we use Bitcoin to pay them. This is a real business. Often it is, like you said, David, actual nation state threat actors, but nonetheless, in most cases, it's a business. And if you're in business, do I attack, Adirondack Medical Center or Carthage individually? That doesn't seem worth my effort if I can attack a vendor that they use as well as 500 other folks across the country. So it's just good business. I hate to word it that way, but that's what they're looking at. And that's why the hospitals alone locking everything down won't solve the problem. And I mentioned two.
Yeah, bears mentioning now that sometimes you have vendors who are not even your vendors. We'll talk later when we get to our discussion about where our data, the little piece of it that actually left our system, where it went to a commercial cloud storage company that had no idea they were being used as a Dropbox for, oh, I shouldn't have used that phrase. It wasn't Dropbox.
Right.
As a storage, a temporary way station for our data, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes.
No, but it's a great point because it could also just be a revenue cycle vendor, for instance, that happens to use some um, software code that was from another third-party vendor that originally was open source. And I'm describing an issue from a couple of years ago that hit thousands and thousands of us. So this can be so many levels deep. And soon that will be the case. It hasn't been particularly yet. That doesn't mean it isn't coming for the medical devices because they're so difficult to update. And both at the federal and state level, funding has been promised, but we're also pushing back that it's operational funding. You know, a small community hospital going out and purchasing the latest whiz-bang cybersecurity whole world system, even if they had the money for it, it isn't going to be particularly useful without the staff that can implement that intelligently, continually update it as the hack attempts are continually updated. So it's important for everyone to realize that this is really operational cost. There isn't a lot of capital cost.
Let me add that this really, every organization in healthcare needs to recognize this as a workforce issue as well, right? Especially if you're a small remote hospital, finding staff IT people who have the professional qualifications and the experience to manage preparation for and response to a ransomware attack, they are hard to come by. And we're not going to have them in New York State if we don't start growing them ourselves through financial incentives for staff to get this kind of training and experience.
Absolutely. I think there's one more slide.
No, then we go to
Oh, that was it for those.
Final words for now, Tom? Anything that you're hopeful about or what you most fear is in our futures?
Oh, I was just looking at the questions and I saw that you said we'd get to them. So, no, I don't think so, other than beyond the regulations, it's about the planning end. That's the key. Really going through both the third party, as you put it, as you mentioned, risk assessment, but the continual planning, including tabletops.
Agreed. And I really, what I want to share more than anything else is my conversion away from the notion that we should try to do as much of this in-house ourselves as we can because resources are scarce. Resources are not scarce operationally in any comparable measure to what it will cost your organization when your turn comes up. And I just don't imagine anyone is going to escape this in the long term. So I think we ought to not be trying, just so that we can communicate up to Albany in the case of New York State and state capitals around the country that this has to be a priority, that we have to have the ability to protect our systems lest we be sitting ducks. And we'll talk later about the case that came out of Massachusetts where a cyber attack resulted in a disclosure or a loss of confidentiality for medical information. And the Office of Civil Rights issued a six-figure fine to a medical management company for not realizing that they had been compromised. All right, so let's move on to Cordell's presentation. As I mentioned earlier, Cordell really brings a global perspective to these issues because he's worked in industry for vendors, for government at multiple levels in New York State, and now serves as the Chief Information Officer for the U.S. Department of Transportation. And I asked him what people in healthcare, and in particular in healthcare in New York, could learn from the larger experience of organizations in every industry trying to protect themselves from various threats. So let us hear from Cordell, and then we'll move on to Sue. Cordell, thank you for joining us, and thank you for helping us out. I'm really curious to know, given what we heard just now from Tom about the state perspective, and in particular, what the requirements are. What is your view, having managed lots of IT systems in government, out of government, in other than healthcare areas? What's your advice to healthcare on what we should be doing above and beyond what we're obligated to do?
Well, what everybody should be doing if they're involved in supporting critical infrastructure in the country is around a very common set of cybersecurity best practices that involve your IT teams, but most importantly, involve everybody connected with the organization, which means the people who work in the institution, the people who use the institution, and then the larger communities that it serves. And what I find is that the recommendations from the government, its own best practices framework published by the Department of Commerce, NIST, which have the responsibility for laying out how to best manage risks in the cybersecurity area, are very complex and very comprehensive, and they have to be because it's a complex area. But on the other hand, none of us can do everything, and none of us can do everything certainly at once. And most of us have inherited a legacy of technology that was not created in the cybersecurity age when it was such an imperative. So it is not designed to meet the current threat environment. So while we ideally replace that infrastructure with modern, in this case, IT infrastructure that will be more resilient from a cybersecurity perspective, we shouldn't let, in some cases, the little that we can do with our existing infrastructure stop us from doing the little that we can do. So what does that mean? So here's a real tangible example, and it involves access control, which is one of the top goals of any cybersecurity risk management framework. So what's now known as multi-factor authentication, MFA, 2FA, it can be in a lot of different formats, but the point is everybody needs to use something other than ID and password.
Mm-hmm. And so, what is your thought about dealing with all of the complicated systems that we have in healthcare that have to be able to talk to each other in real time in order to provide healthcare, and then, of course, to be able to compile the backup data necessary to get paid for the treatment we provide? What should we be thinking about in terms of training for our staff so that they understand just what the risks are with keeping passwords safe and using computers responsibly in terms of, things like storing data on a laptop or a personal device?
So I'll say two things about that. First is healthcare's need to be networked and to communicate in real time does not make it unique. And in fact, it makes it more similar to other forms of critical infrastructure, other forms of commerce, government operations, academia, than it is different from them. So that's something that we all face. And, perhaps 10, 20 years ago, we wouldn't have felt the need to have everything just in time, but that's what we built because it's so much more efficient.
And
The second is,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
if you want to dive further on that, that's fine.
I do, because we have in healthcare made ourselves dependent on all of this technology specifically because it enables us to have access to more information more quickly, which produces better patient care, but creates all the risks that we saw in the ransomware attack that my hospitals were victimized by with the Lockbit criminal syndicate. And I'm wondering if we ought to be thinking about not making ourselves quite so easily accessible from lots of quarters, or do you think that the security apparatus that's available, if we use it, ought to make it safe enough for us to work in real time online?
So I'll answer that question with a quick story. I was in a kind of a high level planning meeting with executives at a certain government, and all around the table, the executives from various agencies were describing their resilient practices. And one of them said, and I believe they slammed on the table a giant ledger. And they said, this is the ledger that my organization has been using for the last 50 years. And we've only been IT oriented for the last 3 or 4 years. So anytime there's a blip, pardon me, anytime there's a blip, we go back to the ledger. And my boss leans over and she goes, do we have a ledger? And I said, absolutely not. And we don't want one. What you do want is resilient IT systems, backup systems, redundant systems, systems that live in another provider's cloud, that use a different technology, perhaps. But you can't go back to the days of stone knives and bare skins, as they say. We're in this computer age. We're here to stay. And what we need to do is understand, how do we correctly operate in that environment? And going back to something I said before, because we rely on infrastructure that was created before the current threats were known, they're just not up to the task. So we do need to modernize our infrastructure that is secure by design, created with the knowledge of the threat environment that we live in. It's also worth adding at this point, the people who threaten us are really not people in their garages, not even similar to the Lockbit syndicate.
Mm-hmm.
They're nation states, and it could be a nation state that's behind Lockbit. So any of us as individuals with our own bank accounts, email accounts, our organizations, no matter what they are really no match if a large nation decides they want to turn their attention to us and see it as a form of warfare. So we need a whole of nation approach where everybody sees their role in providing resiliency in their small environment that leads to a greater net of resiliency across the country.
I can say we've struggled to get away from in the hospitals that I advise. We've struggled to get away from our downtime procedures, as we call them, being a resort to paper. And I'm wondering if you have any particular thoughts about how to make the workstations that we use safe so that our downtime procedure can be another electronic form, because right now, from my experience with our attack back in August, I am at a loss to understand how we would even know what is safe to leave on and what needs to be shut down at the moment. In our case, it was September 1st at 7:19 a.m. At the very moment that you discover you've been attacked, it seems among most people in healthcare IT, the natural impulse is to turn everything off and pull the plugs out. Can we do better?
Yeah. So the first is, and without knowing any particular environment, and to make this comment as generic as possible, Microsoft believes that over 95% of all potential cyber attacks can be prevented by us following 95% of what are called cyber hygiene practices. So not extraordinary practices. So I'll give you a couple of examples of that. Number one, has your computer been bought in the last 3 to 5 years? If not, you need to get on a refresh cycle. That's more rapid than whatever you're on. And the old equipment that you're maintaining, maybe because it runs some software that won't run on new equipment, those are two prime candidates for modernization, both the software as well as the hardware. The second is, even if you have new hardware, is the software, is the operating system on it patched and up to date? And do you have a program from within your IT organization to push those patches out as quickly as possible? So, and I'll just close this thought, this answer with another quick story. Years ago, when we got a patch or an update from Microsoft or from somebody else, we would test it for weeks sometimes, and we were always late in putting those patches out because we wanted to make sure that particular update didn't disable some other custom software. And Microsoft can't test against everything that's out there. But now that's flipped. That some of those those updates or patches are security related, cybersecurity related, and they're so important to put on that we should put them on as soon as we can, and then deal with the broken glass later.
And that's a challenge that we face in healthcare because we are a 24/7, 365 operation, and we need access to all of that information. And I will freely admit, we have gotten dependent upon operating only when we have access to all of our information and all of our vendor sub IT systems. So let's talk about that. Do you have any thoughts to share about dealing with vendors who are software vendors who are in our systems? And I'm asking this because of the recent event in Massachusetts where a healthcare practice management company had a ransomware program running in their system for over a year before they discovered it. And the Office of Civil Rights just issued the first ever fine for a HIPAA violation, $100,000 to the vendor for putting protected health information, PHI, of its clients at risk. What should we be thinking about in that regard?
So this actually raises a terrific point that I can make that is one of the new emerging understandings in cybersecurity. And that's, for years now, we've relied on our perimeter protections, our network protections, to keep us safe. So if we don't let them in the house, then the house is safe. But nothing's ever going to be perfect. No lock is perfect. People can break windows, to continue the analogy. So what happens when they get in? And I believe now there's a consensus that the people who live in the house, the software developers, the IoT equipment manufacturers, also have an obligation and a responsibility to make their portion of the system secure by design, so that they are sharing that load with the rest of the organization. So that an organization like yours, and really, again, healthcare is not unique, doesn't have to think that I have all my eggs in the basket of my network, and then if the network fails, I'm just going to accept that it's fair game. It shouldn't be. And part of modernization should be buying software, Internet of Things devices, other equipment that itself has protections against being compromised. And that will come from the marketplace of all of us, both private, public, academia, demanded of our vendors.
And speaking of that, what do you think we ought to be doing in order to verify with our vendors what the nature of their protections are? We have complicated IT licensing agreements with lots of obligations, frankly, on the hospital, on the healthcare organization side. I think the people in our audience today would like to have a better perspective about what is reasonable to demand of our IT healthcare vendors.
So I'm going to now refer to our federal government, of which I am employed. So all biases up front about this.
And we've already informed the audience that you're speaking on your own behalf and not on behalf of the federal government.
Right. But the federal government does hold itself to a high standard. And if you look at some of the requirements for the federal government's own agencies, you'll have a better idea of what's needed to be more secure as an operator of critical infrastructure. Further, there's assistance available from DHS, Department of Homeland Security, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, specifically sector by sector and for the healthcare sector, that will help you understand what the best practices in your sector are, and begin to help you create some sort of a roadmap to reach them. Because I think this is, none of us have extra money. And even those of us, maybe personally, that have extra money are never going to admit it. So what if we have goals to reach in the area of cybersecurity, that the only place to find that money is to somehow degrade our mission? And I think that that's an unacceptable choice. And together we need to lobby, and I'm going to literally lobby in the non-political way, but advocate for greater funding for infrastructure security, support from the various organizations on which we depend for funding and support, so that we can get better together. Otherwise, it surely is just a race to the bottom. Our adversaries are out there watching, and they are all too eager to exploit vulnerabilities that we decide to ignore or buy on the cheap, and will pay more in recovery than we would have paid in preventing it in the first place.
Sure. And Tom talked about what the state of New York is doing to create both standards for IT security at the sort of technical level, especially with our business associates, given all of the health information we carry, but also what our obligation ought to be, both the minimum standard, which is always the legal standard, and the higher standard, the standard of care, the professional ethical norms around two subjects that you and I have discussed at great length. One is reporting cyber attacks, ransomware attacks to law enforcement at the moment they happen. And of course, the larger question that everyone in our audience is here to learn about, should you pay the ransom?
So that's a great topic to end my portion of your session with. And that's, everybody needs to support. Everybody needs to report. Gone are the days that anyone should think there's any stigma having been compromised by a cyber adversary. All of us live in glass houses, and by not disclosing, as is in many cases required, to CISA or to the FBI, we make ourselves and our communities weaker. We need to have the very best intelligence about what's going on, who the active cyber threat actors are, and in a coordinated way, with the advice of people who have been through it before, judge what you need to do. And I'm not going to give universal advice that applies to every situation, except that to report if you believe or have serious or have sufficient information to believe that your system has been compromised before you start pulling the plugs, because it could be the only way that we can tell if in fact you've been compromised, if data has been exfiltrated, if a system is totally compromised, is by checking on it while it's still running. And you need the help of experts to do that in a way that minimizes your immediate additional risk.
And that is one of the essential ethical dilemmas that all healthcare organizations face at the moment that they discover that they've been attacked, because in order to continue our patient care function, we have this enormous urge to get everything rebooted, secured, and back operating as quickly as possible. And that left my hospitals with difficult decisions to make about whether to turn everything off and reset it or not in those first few days. Are there ways of going about making that decision that our audience ought to be thinking about?
Well, I'll leave you with this thought. We're in a new environment. Even people who have been compromised by a cyber adversary in the past may be compromised in a new way in the future. There's no way to know what you should do or what the best path is, except by getting the maximum amount of information, get people in to evaluate your current situation. And again, that starting point for reporting is the FBI or CISA.
Well, Cord, thank you so much. This has been really helpful. I think you've given our audience today and the healthcare delivery community in general permission not to think that we ought to be able to do all of this ourselves. And for that, I'm grateful.
Thank you, David.
And let's move on to our first participation code, which is Lockbit. Everyone write that down so that you can fill out your evaluation form at the end of the program. Those are posted on the event page of the Columbia Bioethics webpage. Participation code Lockbit. And now let's move on to Sue Regan. So I imposed heavily on Susan's and my long working relationship to ask her to come here and not prepare herself for every possible question or scenario or concern. Cordell certainly raised lots of them that I had not thought much about before we had our ransomware experience. I want to say, by the way, that the one thing that most rattled me from Cordell's comments was that healthcare isn't special, where our IT issues are not unique. I always thought we were kind of unique, so I have to reflect on that some. But what I've asked Sue to do this evening is stand in for all of you in the audience and everyone who is in healthcare in New York and beyond, who hasn't been victim of ransomware attack, so that we can have a conversation about what occurred to her in listening to what I had to say about our experience, what Tom and Cordell had to say more globally, and what she thinks hospital and healthcare organization counsel ought to be talking to their leadership about right now. So, Sue, what struck you? Anything really just sort of, catch you off guard?
Well, you asked me to respond as someone who's entirely naive on the subject, and that I find that to be easy. Although I'm guessing, along with everyone attending this session, we're less naive now than we were before, because in thinking about this, I approach it like every other difficult situation which comes to the desk of the in-house counsel. And that is, you have to go through a certain, call it an algorithm, It's obvious who your client is. Your client is the entity, not any individual. And because of that, you initially, I think, in these kinds of matters, have to involve the board. This is clearly a board matter. So part of what you would just do intuitively without knowing more is advise the CEO on how to involve the board. That I think is a starting point. And then you have to take stock of who the stakeholders are, whose interests need to be protected. What are the duties of the board to the mission? Obviously, everything I'm going to say is quite obvious because I'm the naive one. But to whom do you owe a duty? And that would be patients, present, former, future patients. What is the extent of of your duty to them? What do you have to, what kinds of information needs to be communicated? Your employees, your medical staff, obviously important stakeholders. What do you communicate to them when? And also the public, because you are advising a board who's in charge of an asset that belongs to the public in part. And so there's an interest in the community that has to be protected. So all of these things involve a difficult PR question, which you have to consider. And then there are the legal issues, the obvious ones, HIPAA. I would do a very quick check on the state of our compliance with HIPAA security provisions and make sure that we're ready to shoulder the burden that's about to hit. I'm happy to hear that there are going to be regs coming from DOH.
Right.
Unfortunately, they're not here yet, but I think DOH could still be of some assistance in helping to sort this out. And I think the things I would do right away are check the insurance. I mean, one thing that in-house counsel does and has to do very carefully is make sure that the coverage is adequate and up to date, that we're in compliance with any ratios or any requirements that we have. I would look at that instantly, contact the insurance and see what services they have available. I know that there are some things that anyone issuing coverage in cyber security has to provide. And I would make sure that they're on board with that and I understand what those things are.
And Susan, if I could jump in there.
Yes.
While we're discussing that, I've heard from those who have been through this as well. It's very important to know in advance the insurance procedures and meet with them and discuss those. For instance, some have said that their insurance provider had specific cybersecurity auditors that they use immediately to dig into your network and see the extent of the problem that the organization had no relationship with. And didn't want to use because they have organizations that they have a relationship with that already knows their network. So it's important to work all of that out in advance as well.
Yeah.
And Tom, that was one of the challenges that I faced and something that we can talk about in more detail when we get to our broader discussion. But yeah, we thought we had our cyber insurance in good shape and we did, but only discovered that it was all working properly once we dug into this. And yes, as Tom pointed out, you are often obligated under the terms of your policy to hire a cyber counsel and cyber consultants who are approved by your insurance company. And that, of course, creates the same ethical conflict of interest for those advisors as is always the case when an insurance company insists that you hire an attorney off of their panel. And Sue, you were spot on saying that that's something that you have to jump on right away. I wonder, Sue, what is your sense of who needs to be involved in that conversation? You've advised all kinds of healthcare organizations. What was your sort of first thought of, oh, I've got to call this one and that one?
Are you asking in terms of insurance or?
Yeah, to deal
Oh,
with the rolling out the insurance coverage part of the discussion.
well, it's usually a matter that the council deals with
Mhm.
and the risk management people. I'm not aware that there's any other people that are, I mean, IT obviously would have
Yeah.
to be involved. But that all of that has to be done long in advance. If you haven't got a good grip on what your insurers are able to do for you, and if you're not in compliance with your obligations, you're in big trouble because, I mean, the question of whether you pay the ransom is going to come up, and it sure is nice if you have an insurance, a pot of money there that will help with that. So that would be, I think, an important obligation of in-house counsel.
Absolutely. And I realized as you started speaking that I left out your most important credential and qualification for tonight's program, which is that you teach in the Columbia Bioethics program, the same course that I do, law and bioethics. So let me move this into our ethical realm. When we talk about duty to patients, duty to staff, and duty to community, did you have an initial sense as to what the potential conflicts are between your obligation to a particular patient whose information may or may not have been compromised and the obligation you have to the community to protect the organization's reputation? Because I can tell you that's something that I wrestled with, and I'm continually soliciting our colleagues' opinions about how do you strike that balance. So did you have any initial reaction to what Tom and Cordell had to say about balancing individual and community interests?
Um, that's something that really you have to do all the time. HIPAA is pretty clear about what the obligations are to tell your patients, your current patients, and people who prior patients, if their information has been compromised. So, we've all received those notices and they're pretty ho-hum. I don't know that, at least at the outset, there's anything more you have to do for the patients. But the problem is really, how do you continue giving care? And it's interesting that Cordell said not to, you don't shut down, you don't pull the plug. My instinct would have been to pull the plug. But if there comes a time when you have to shut down, then, what are your obligations to the service area, to the patients residing in the service area? If you're the only emergency department in the service area, or if you're the only one providing certain specialties, you really have to inform the public about that. Do you have to put, it strikes me that it would be nice to have relationships with other providers. And in many areas, there are networks of providers so that you can call on those for, how to provide access. But that's a serious PR problem because you
Yeah.
lose patients, you've lost them. You don't want that to happen. So again, it's a balancing.
And it was really challenging for me personally and for my organizations to deal with the uncertainty of whose information may have been compromised and whose information clearly was. And I said a moment ago, we are still many months into this process because of this whole cloud provider situation that we stumbled into that we'll get to in our broader discussion, but we're still not certain what information of what individual patients was compromised. We know a lot about the categories of information. We know a lot about what servers they were on and therefore what areas of hospital operations were involved. Fortunately for us, a lot of it was, kind of silly things like schedules and inventory of supplies, but we know some indexing and other sort of aggregate data about patient care was on the servers that we are still digging through. And I'm talking about 60, 70,000 files that have to be inspected. And so the ethical question that I continue to wrestle with, and I'm interested to know your thoughts on this, Sue, is at what level of certainty, and in particular, who decides at what level of certainty do you make notifications to large numbers of individual patients when you're not yet actually sure that their individual protected health information has been compromised? Any thought about how that should be handled?
Well, I think the harder one would be demographic information. I mean, I don't personally care so much about if somebody knows if I had my appendix out, but I sure do care if they have my social security number.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think, one question, it's a little bit like diagnostics with medical ethics. If you tell someone information that there's nothing they can do about,
Mm-hmm.
there's no way they can remedy or mitigate the situation, then it's almost unfair to tell them. However, if you think there's even the slightest possibility that demographic information has been,
Compromised, shared.
Yeah, then there is something they can do about it. And I think you have the obligation to tell them, we will confirm if we can be sure of it, but we think we may have had this information gathered by someone. This is what you should do. And then you tell them who to call, how to how to protect their financial information. There's a lot you can advise patients and former patients to do. So I think in that case, you do have the obligation.
Yeah, and we should really point out that this is a hybrid responsibility because HIPAA obviously relates to protected health information. There are state laws in New York and most states that relate to protection of PII, personally identifiable information, which focuses on things like Social Security numbers and birth dates and all of that. Tom, I feel like you want to jump in on this. Did you have?
Well, I wanted to really ask you both. There's speculation that this applies to Change Healthcare hack at the moment. Exactly what you're discussing.
Mm-hmm.
So, because their statements continue to say kind of what David just said, that they gained access to information, and they say that they're going to, notify patients as required by law if necessary, and they're working with the government to do so, but not actually notifying anyone yet. So it certainly sounds like I've speculated, but let's just use this as a separate example. I've seen other sites where when they were attacked, information was stolen, but the database was encrypted. So you have, and this is possibly what's occurring here. It may not be. I suspect it is. But sometimes what's stolen, because one of the things we now try to do is encrypt a database even when at rest, as they call it. So if the database they stole is encrypted, or even just the file, this could be a spreadsheet to make it easier to understand. If they've stolen an encrypted spreadsheet, now what they'll do is they'll steal it and re-encrypt it so you can't access it either. And now nobody can. But nonetheless, they have that, and they might someday break into it. I know they have it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very gray area for me. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
You make a really good point, Tom. And we should, as a matter of terminology, clarify for the audience that the word encryption has two entirely different meanings in this discussion. And I have taken in the meetings that we have where we are now discussing this endlessly, taken to refer to good encryption and bad encryption. Good encryption is when we encrypted our files so that even if they left the system, they were protected. Bad encryption is what the threat actors, the bad guys, do to prevent you from having access to your own information, even when it's still sitting on your servers. And it is one of the most vexing issues for individual organizations that have been hit by ransomware to sort of troubleshoot and flesh out what information that was subject to bad encryption was also subject to good encryption. And we're fighting that battle of ignorance as we speak. And we'll get to that in a few minutes, because this is the whole issue of what is an appropriate response. And of course, the answer to those questions, to the extent that you can come up with an answer, is the basis for answering the question, should you pay the ransom or not? So we're going to get to that in just a few minutes. But Sue, I want to go back to you because you raised a really important point about what an organization ought to be telling its community when it's not sure, recognizing, as you said, that we've all become largely numb to these notifications and the offer of 1 year of free credit monitoring by one of the big three credit monitoring agencies every time there's a breach. Do you have a sense as to whose decision that ought to be? Because in every organization, there's sort of the lawyer, there's the senior leadership, the CEO, the COO, there's the financial part of it. Of course, IT is going to have their opinion about how certain we can be what PHI and what PII has left the system. What's your gut tell you about who should be ultimately making those kinds of decisions?
Well, I think I would turn to HIPAA. I mean, HIPAA tells us what we can be told.
Mm-hmm.
There's a person responsible for keeping that information and distributing it when the law requires. And then the senior leadership, the COO, the CEO.
Yeah. No, one of the challenges is the sort of siloing of expertise, right? You as organizational counsel will have expertise on the statute. IT will obviously know your IT infrastructure better than anyone. How to strike a balance between wanting to inform individual members of the community that their information may be at risk against the important goal of maintaining clear communication to the larger community. And now let me throw one of the wrinkles that I wanted you to not be prepared for. The bad guys are monitoring all of this. All of your public communication, and our audience should be cognizant of this, especially if you've been either explicit that you're not paying the ransom or sort of dragging the negotiations out. And those are both strategies that have their place in given situations. The bad guys are on Google looking for what the local press coverage is to assess how much an organization is on its knees so that they know how much to negotiate, whether to drop their demand, whether to leak some information to create a PR crisis. And that's a tough balance to strike because you want to be forthright with your community, but you don't want to feed into the threat actors' ability to leverage you.
Well,
What do
I
you do?
would hope. Um, I don't know what happened in your situation. Were you actually directly dealing with these lockbit people?
Oh, yes.
Um,
They sent
and did the
emails.
FBI offer any assistance in that?
Well, they did the best they could, and let's talk about that part of it when we get to our discussion, because in that I want to bring in the whole technology aspect of our information having gone to a specific cloud storage company that we were able to identify through our cyber defenses. So we'll get to that in a moment. Let's talk about the difficult organizational ethical question first, which is balancing the desire to be transparent with the community and the desire not to undermine your position with the bad guys who are communicating with you, I should tell you, through the dark web. One of the first communications that we got. Yeah, right.
How does that
At
work? How do you know you're on the dark web?
Let me explain. So the first communication that I referred to, that's September 1st, 2023 at 7:19 a.m. was the bold smack in the face threat. We've got all your data, it's encrypted and it's been exfiltrated, and if you don't pay us the ransom immediately, we're going to ruin you. And then it has a URL, literally a web page on the dark web. I think I have a vague idea of what the difference is between the dark web and the not dark web. Tom, if you have any education on that, I'd be curious to know what you have to say. But they direct you to a place where you get messages directly from the bad guys. Here's the funny thing, and it's not funny in a pleasant way. When we weren't quickly enough responding to their demands, and when we weren't quickly enough cooperating with, and I don't like this phrase, but it is the industry accepted term, asking for the proof of life, which is a whole technologically involved process of asking them to produce something that you know existed. So you're testing their ability to find it and unencrypt it and all of that. They want this all to happen very quickly. And when it wasn't happening quickly enough, somebody in our business office actually got a phone call from someone saying that they were calling on behalf of the Lockbit criminal syndicate to make sure that we were getting their messages, and why weren't we responding faster? So that's what you're up against. How does that make you feel?
The dark web is basically just a separate encrypted piece of the same network. It was running on the same hardware, but it's generally the Tor browser, which is a browser you're using if you want to hide everything you're doing. So as a general rule, those who are on it are up to something. But the idea is to not just encrypt what you're doing, but hide where you're doing it from. So that I connect to other servers, like you would on any VPN. I connect to other servers in other countries, and then my traffic appears to be coming from there. And you can't trace back theoretically to where I am.
There you go. In fact, that phone call, just another darkly humorous moment. We were able to ascertain in a very limited sense that the phone call came from either Russia or Kazakhstan. So there you go. So Sue, back to the ethics. You've got the bad guys looking over your shoulder. You want to be transparent with your community. You don't want to undermine your negotiating position with the bad guys. You have a sort of sense as to
let me just say, you don't have a negotiating position with the bad guys. I mean, they don't teach you this in law school. I mean,
no.
I think, if the FBI can't help with this, I'd be very disappointed. I mean,
well, it's important here to remember who's incentivized to do what.
Right.
So, and you may have some negotiating position because they may not be aware of all of your backups. Hopefully they aren't. So
Mhm.
that you have a good backup from yesterday, but it'd be nice to get what they stole, but you don't need it. Or they got, and you may not know this yet, so you're delaying to find that out. But also remember the incentives for the FBI are to never pay
Right. Of course.
because that stops this. If nobody ever paid, well, why would I bother doing it anymore? I mean, for pure mayhem, I guess, if I'm
Mhm.
the Russian state, maybe, but it pays for itself at least because people do have to pay.
Right.
So
Although
it's
we
it's
didn't,
careful
but
to
we'll
say
get to
this.
that. Yep,
Yep, but to
we'll get to
use
that
the
later.
FBI for negotiating isn't ideal here, unfortunately.
Yeah, but Sue, you make a really important point that you want to turn to the FBI to get that sharing of information and experience to find out if this is a coordinated attack, if it's regional, if it's national, global, but you also very much are on your own working with your insurance company, the cyber counsel that they very, very strongly urge you to select because they have to pay for it. The cyber consultants who actually do the technical analysis of your system, and I learned a lot more than I ever wanted to know about IT forensics, I can promise you. But yeah, that is the dilemma. You're trying to decide, do I need to pay the ransom? And that's not something you can know right away because, and this goes to Cordell's point, you can have all of your computer infrastructure and you've done all your risk assessments and you've had the system built with redundancy. You don't know if your backup is workable until you go to restore it. And that begs the question, as complicated as it is, should we be having not tabletop exercises, but actual live shutdowns and restorations from backup so that we can test whether our backup is actually as reliable as we have been told they are by the vendors, and as reliable as we need them to be in order to be able to continue patient care. And that's the dilemma.
And the answer is yes, but not necessarily taking down your systems to do it, but you can bring them up on a couple of devices, for instance, and just prove that they work. But that should be tested.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's what I've learned tonight. I still don't know anything about IT, but I sure know that you need an incident plan. You need to have something in place,
And a
whether the
safe
regs
backup,
require it or not.
safe backup is the most important aspect to this whole thing.
Right.
And by
And then you
safe,
can
we
tell them,
mean
if you know that your backup is good, can't you tell them to go pound salt?
basically,
I mean,
if you know, if you're
if you
certain,
know for sure.
largely. I mean, now some of the files David's talking about may or may not be on your backup, or different backups that might have been accessible. So it's a little more complicated. But if you're just talking about your EMR data, for instance, then yes, if I always joke that if you still had your backups on tape, you're probably all set. Now that would probably take 6 days to load, so it wouldn't work anyway. But you need them separate, and that's not as easy as it sounds because they have to connect at some point in order to download the data.
Without Tom revealing any security details, I can tell you it takes a whole lot more than 6 days to restore
Right.
from magnetic tape backup.
Yeah.
We can talk about that privately, but yeah,
Yes.
that, Sue, to your point, is part of the organizational challenge. So you and I, as counsel, one of the first things we want to know from the tech people is how much of our backup can be restored how quickly so that we can make an informed decision about whether to even entertain paying the ransom based on the impact of the success or failure or partial failure of the restoration process. And that's exactly it. So you've asked precisely the right question, which is exactly why I asked you to be here tonight in your ignorant state. So let's dive in, because we've got, I don't know, about 18 minutes. By the way, if anyone has any questions, let me remind you to put them in the Q&A box. And let's talk about these issues of confidentiality and when and how do you decide whether to pay the ransom? So, second participation code is ransomware. So write that down, and we're going to move on. Any questions?
I'm happy to take a stab at a couple of the questions I see.
Please, we have a question about the new SEC regulations, and specifically the SEC rule that requires disclosure of material cybersecurity incidents, with the caveat that obviously the SEC, being the Securities and Exchange Commission, only applies to publicly traded companies. So, Tom, what's your sense about that?
Yeah, as far as I know, unless something's changed, that doesn't apply to not-for-profit hospitals. However, it gets a little more complicated, of course, when, for instance, it's Change Healthcare and it does apply to them. And they're a great example as well, because the confusion, the AHA right now is asking Health and Human Services to specifically state that any patient health information that is breached, the notification should only apply to Change and not all the individual hospitals. But it's a very confusing situation, because for some services, Change Healthcare might be a BAA
Right.
contract. But for other services, they are actually a HIPAA-covered entity, because a clearinghouse is itself a HIPAA-covered. So it's a very confusing state that I think we're going to learn a lot from, for better or worse.
Oh, for
Mostly
sure.
worse.
And in particular, with regard to the vendors that a clearinghouse like Change Healthcare, and Change Healthcare isn't the only clearinghouse, but it's one of the biggest. And of course, it's owned by United Healthcare, which itself is a very interesting question of conflicts of interest when the payer that we're relying upon for revenue for large numbers of patients, even in New York, with all not-for-profit hospitals, they also own the clearinghouse that is now responsible for what may turn out to be the largest HIPAA breach in the history of HIPAA, in the history of the country. So these are really interesting questions that hospital counsel and all of the consultants and advisors that you have to bring in when you're hit by a ransomware attack are going to be wrestling with for months, years, perhaps decades. So yeah, let's shift this discussion into the context of this event in Massachusetts. So this was the announcement in the middle of November, just a few months ago, of this company, Doctors Management Service, that was a service provider to practices, to clinical practices, and they discovered that they had ransomware in their system only when the bad guys finally got around to asking for the ransom. And that was years later. And what's interesting, of course, is that that's the opposite of the experience we had. Our network security software alerted us immediately that there was something unusual going on. There is that lag of making sense out of what that means. That's always going to be a human analysis and a human decision, but we were therefore able to shut the thing down before much of any information left our system. In the case of Doctors Management, DMS, they had the bad guys living in their system for over a year, undetected. And what the Office of Civil Rights concluded from their investigation is that DMS's risk assessment and their security tools and their detection tools were substantially below industry standards, hence the $100,000 fine. I wonder what the ripple effect of that fine and the discovery of that circumstance is going to have on our relationship with our vendors. It was part of the question I asked Cordell, but something we should dive into as part of our discussion. Are we able to ask the right questions of our vendors to find out what their vulnerabilities are and what their experiences have been? I mean, if I were a hospital or a doctor's practice that used DMS, I would want to know whether they told the practice as soon as they knew, even if that was a year or more delayed, how transparent were they with their clients, who are, of course, healthcare providers? That's a scary.
And that's actually a question that I see about the third parties and how can you decide who to select? And so there are tools out there to help. They aren't free, but nothing is. But there are tools that what a lot of organizations do is have entire teams that send out assessment surveys to every vendor before they'll contract with them. And now they're trying to do it annually, where they're required to answer a large set of questions. But there are also third parties. I think OneTrust is one of them. I'm trying to remember the rest of the names, but there are a number of vendors who will actually scour what's on the internet, what they can assess of their network from there, but also publicly available information. So if they're a public company, for instance, there are SEC reports. There might even be reports of what they spend on security. But there are organizations are assessed by these third parties with kind of a red, yellow, green scale, if you will, on how great their services are. And I'll tell you, one of them didn't have a great review of change before this happened.
Right.
But that's certainly not going to tell you everything, because if the organization hasn't been hacked before and seems to be doing pretty, seems to cover all the bases, they could still be hacked, as we know. But it again lessens that potential, and there are tools you mentioned our relationships. I didn't note because I didn't realize we'd go down this road, but Haney's does partner with a company called Sensinet. So I do have a conflict of interest there that provides some tools to help you automate that assessment process. So there are, and to benchmark, but there are others. So there are companies out there that are looking to assist with how you review these third parties. And as we talked about earlier, how you benchmark against others.
So you've given full disclosure, Tom. You are ethically in clear water, not to worry.
All right.
So Sue, let me throw another impossible question in your lap, because I'm tainted from my experience. You send one of your IT vendors that has access to your patient's PHI, whether it's billing software or dictation software or whatever, you send them one of these risk assessments because you've been to this program and all of a sudden you're taking your vulnerability much more seriously. And the vendor says, yeah, no, we don't do those. Just trust us that our system is secure, but we're not going to answer your questionnaire. As lawyer, in-house, outside counsel, how do you respond? How would you advise your client to deal with a vendor that just doesn't want to participate in good IT hygiene activities?
Obviously, you look for their competitor. I understand in a rural environment, there may be difficulty finding competitors. I don't know. But
you raise a really important point, because it's not even so much rural versus urban. Mm-hmm. It's very small versus very large.
Right. And cost, of course.
Well, and the fact that the vendors all watch each other as well. And I can tell you, as I've become more sensitized to the risk that vendors can present to us at my hospitals, I'm asking these questions and finding that there is often uniformity of response within a particular product line, so that all of the potential vendors for pick a service, dictation, revenue cycle, whatever, they all say, oh yeah, no, we're not going to participate in your risk assessment. And by the way, you're not going to find another vendor that will provide the service that you need without a limitation of damages provision in their contract. And I don't have an answer to that question, but I have advised my hospitals that we have to, in each and every case, take a good hard look at whether we really need to do that with an outside software vendor that is not willing to take responsibility for their own mistakes. And
Right.
that is a really hard conversation for lawyers to have with their institutions. But I would suggest to you that if we don't, shame on us.
Huge risk. I mean, I mean, I don't know what can be done contractually to shift the risk to the company that refuse, but that would be pretty unsatisfying, I think.
It is a hard pill to swallow, to be sure, and something that I think we may take up at a future CLE program, because it is its own separate but related set of both legal, business, and ethical dilemmas for hospitals.
Yeah.
So
I
you may
do
be
see a bunch of other
wondering-
questions.
Please.
Well, one was, is there a dialogue in New York State about risk pools for cyber insurance? And not that I know of, but it sounds like a decent idea, although, like the insurance company, that risk pool will require some base minimum for you to join. So I think as the regulations come and we have standards, that might be something we look at, but we've really got to have standards that can be audited. And as you'll see, if you're renewing your cyber insurance, it will depend very much now what you pay on what you can prove you're doing.
Well, and the whole notion of risk pooling is a really interesting thought and something that needs to be considered. But that leaves us with the very difficult decision of who do we want to risk pool with?
And that's my point of the standards. Yes, absolutely.
Well, and also, do you want to risk pool with an organization that's about your size, number of admissions, dollars in revenue, or do you want to try to get in with the biggest group you can, or maybe a smaller group? And again, as with our discussion about vendors, how do you assess whether that's somebody you literally want to get in bed with, right? Because that's what a risk pool is. So it's a really interesting question, certainly something to explore, but something that I would approach with great caution, because you don't know. It goes back to one of those age-old sexually transmissible diseases metaphors. You don't know who your partner has slept with, and you don't know who the people that they slept with have slept with, and all of that is part of your risk profile. So it's a tricky question. I thought the next question was really interesting, and that is, what if you don't know what's been hacked? So the question is, if the patient record is hacked and you can't retrieve it, or even if you can, given AI, is it possible that the hackers had changed the information in the record? So in effect, they could spoof you by what they share back as evidence of what records they have. And if you're still in that restoration stage, because this is all a very dynamic discussion, we know you can't trust the hackers. When we caught them lying about something and we responded on the dark web, they said, well, we're criminals. We're allowed to lie. Literally, those were the words. It was surreal.
Self-awareness.
Yes.
Interesting, I guess.
Well, which
I,
raises the
I would
point.
say to this
Yeah.
question, though, that it's at least at the moment, extraordinarily unlikely that that will be a concern. Now, it depends on the files, but the example noted, the doctor accessing a record, that assumes this is like an EMR file, EMR database, that they would understand the database enough to dig in there and somehow edit it without corrupting it so that I couldn't even load it in and see the record. Is extremely unlikely. Now, not impossible. It used to be extremely unlikely that they could even get into an EMR, and yet here they are. So it's certainly possible down the road that we could see that. But it's also important to note that everything that happens now is because there's value in doing it. And so that's a lot of work to figure out how to do that. I used to program at an EMR vendor, and I wouldn't know how to do it now. And it's likely, even like we said, potentially encrypted itself. It would be more of an issue if they're stealing some spreadsheets with thousands and thousands of records in them. I wish people would never download them anymore. I teach a class in a graduate class in management of health information technology, and I scolded them all, physicians included, that don't ever download data to a spreadsheet from your electronic medical record. It's just a recipe for disaster.
Right.
Go to IT and figure out how to do it safely. I know it takes longer, but.
Yep. So we've only got a couple more minutes, and there are a couple of really interesting questions that we should address. One asks, even with strong backup, is there an obligation to pay the ransom in order to get the return of personal data of your patients? And I have to tell you, we wrestled with that question and concluded at the end of the day, no, there's no duty. It might be a good business decision, but the reason there's no duty is not immediately obvious. It's because paying the ransom is no guarantee that you're actually going to get the information back. There is a rumor circulating that Change Healthcare actually paid a substantial ransom and got nothing in exchange. So that was one of the questions that we really, really wrestled with. And then the final question, and how do you know that the backup isn't hackable? And that goes to that risk assessment, right? Your backup needs to be located somewhere that is not connected to the internet. And then you have to have backups of your backups at different ages, remote from when you might be exposed to an attack. It's all very complicated and very expensive. So a little bit of good news. I'm sorry, did you want to say something?
No, just agreeing with you.
Yeah. So a little bit of good news. The criminal syndicate that attacked us, Lockbit, was actually hacked. The FBI and other law enforcement organizations around the world got into the site, encrypted it, changed all the passwords, and posted this on the dark web page. This site is now under control of law enforcement, and we subsequently were invited to make a request for the decryption key for our data. And we're now, Sue, to your point earlier, we're now waiting to see if the FBI is going to be able to actually produce that decryption key so that we can see firsthand what information was taken. But it's just surreal. This just happened, February 20th? Yeah. And then, of course, this past Monday, there was the state actor Chinese group that was caught. So I think law enforcement is making some progress. The message I want everyone to be clear about, though, is the FBI's objective is the larger criminal threat, and they're not going to compromise their investigation to help an individual victim. And that was one of the lessons we took away from our interactions, that they were very well-meaning and they clearly wanted to help, but their law enforcement goals are much bigger than any one victim. So yes, to get an idea of what data was taken, we actually brought a lawsuit in the Supreme Court of the state of New York against Lockbit. And we did that just to give us the basis to get into court to serve a subpoena on the cloud storage company that Lockbit had transferred some of our data to. And we are now literally pouring through tens of thousands of files with millions of lines of data in them to determine what PHI and what PII was compromised for what patients. It is an exhaustive and terribly, terribly expensive process. So, does it end? When I find out, I promise I will let you all know. But right now, I think this is going to be a major part of my professional responsibility for months or years.
And you know, we discussed that topic, and I run a statewide hospital privacy and security group, and we discussed that topic just last week because Change Healthcare, or United, had the money, at least for some of their systems, that were clearly breached, and they couldn't spend the 6 months you're spending trying to figure it all out, and instead have completely rebuilt an entirely new network, an entirely new software package. And as was commented in there, boy, it'd be nice to have the money for that. That's not a real option for you, I assume, or most of us. So it's exceedingly difficult to be certain that there is nothing left on your network.
Right. And that is our challenge. So thank you, both of you, and thank you to Cordell, and thank you to our support team at Columbia. I certainly learned a lot tonight. I always go away from these sessions feeling somewhat empowered and somewhat panicked. So if you're feeling that way, you're in good company. If you find these kinds of programs useful, we're doing another one next month, looking at the battle with the Drug Enforcement Administration over psilocybin. So that is Thursday again, April 18th, same time, same station. And you can scan the QR code to register, or just go to our Columbia Bioethics events webpage, and you can register there. I look forward to seeing everyone in our audience at future events. And if you have suggestions for other topics you would like us to tackle, there is no question too hard or too messy, because that's why we're here. And if you find all of this kind of law, ethics, public policy, risk management of interest, I invite you to check out our master's program and our certificate program. You can get information on our webpage as well, or feel free to email me at dnh2101@columbia.edu. Again, thank you, Tom, and thank you, Susan, and good night, everyone.